live stream. So today, our speaker is Megan Weis, who is a PhD candidate in United States history at the University of Utah. She has also been a public historian for Utah Historical Society and has worked with local museums in the state, including a traveling expedition with the Smithsonian, which actually was here last semester on rural America for those who visited the library. She has also hosted a weekly radio show on Utah history called Beehive Now, and is currently the University of Utah's Tanner Fellow of Mormon History. And today her presentation is titled "The Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, the First 50 Years." So let's welcome Megan Weis.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. To begin my talk, I would really like to extend my thanks to Dr. Freeman for inviting me here to speak to you all. As a PhD candidate, most of my days are kind of spent in isolation, just working on this topic. So to be able to come to the real world and share it with you all is really exciting. So thank you for having me. All right. Most people growing up in Utah have at least one memory of a pioneer relic haul from their childhood. Perhaps it was a roadside museum in a log cabin, or a fourth grade school trip to the local museum to learn about the history of Utah's settlers. Undoubtedly, these museums captured their attention for these overwhelming displays of artifacts, stacked on top of each other or side by side, showing the entire spectrum of pioneer life: wedding dresses, butter churns, masonry tools, obstetric implements, musical instruments, and perhaps most shockingly, Victorian mourning wreaths crafted out of actual human hair. A little bit of background on this. This was a really popular craft as part of the mourning culture in Victorian America. I'm obsessed with this. It's my special interest, but we can talk about it after if you're interested. Point is, visitors to these small museums across Utah were usually visiting one of the state's oldest and most influential historical societies of all time, the Daughters of Utah Pioneers, or the DUP. Formed in 1901, the DUP is a women's heritage organization responsible for running museums, collecting historic artifacts, organizing Days of 47 parades, and so much more. They operate an estimated 16% of all Utah museums, and they have a membership numbering in the thousands. But how did they rise to such influence? And what is the driving force behind the women volunteering their time and efforts to this important organization? In my talk today, I'm honored to share my research with you, documenting the first 50 years of this important group. To begin, the DUP is a volunteer-run organization with 501c3 nonprofit status. The women involved with the DUP are mostly descendants of the settlers who came to Utah between 1847 and 1869. But this genealogical connection is not required to gain membership status. Across the state of Utah, into Arizona, Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, and even internationally across the world, registered DUP members meet regularly, either in person or on Zoom, to follow pre-planned lessons that are compiled by the organization's governing board in Salt Lake City. This state central board is located at the Pioneer Memorial Museum, a 6-floor museum built in 1950 with both state and DUP funds. The DUP is governed by a president, as well as committee leaders who oversee general projects such as tracking membership, managing the museum's library, and planning lessons. So my interest in the DUP began back in 2016. There I am. I had just graduated from college, and I landed this job cataloging artifacts at the Utah State Historical Society. While there, I developed a passion for material culture. What small things from history get preserved? Who do they belong to? And what does that tell us about Utah history and identity? While I was at the Historical Society, there was a lot of discussion about the DUP and their vast influence on Utah's museums, or relic halls. Most pioneer material culture from Utah's history, so items dating back to 1847 to 1869, are owned by the DUP. While I was working in this basement of an old train station in downtown Salt Lake, learning about the importance of humidity control or acid-free storage boxes, the DUP's collection of over 80,000 artifacts was up on Capitol Hill on full display for all to see. Anyone who works in this space of museums and archives in Utah knows that the DUP do something markedly different from the rest of the heritage industry. They do things their own way. The DUP have minimal interpretation or exhibit design on their artifacts, ordering them usually by item type and only placing a label identifying the item's pioneer collection. As you can see here, they have really been doing this method since their beginnings. They also have a policy to never put a pioneer item in storage. If a family donates an object to the DUP, it is mandated that the organization have it on display for the family to visit, forever. In the world of the DUP, this is part of what they call the, quote, solemn covenant between the Daughters of Utah Pioneers, the state of Utah, and the donors of relics, unquote. No object entrusted to the DUP's care can ever be taken from the building once it enters. The service they provide is kind of like a cemetery or a final resting place for pioneer descendants' most cherished heirlooms. To me, there's something incredibly beautiful about this. Although I'm an academic historian who always has to weigh facts against each other and interpret the past in kind of this abstract intellectual way, I realize that for the average American, the past is about family. It is about material things, like that old family heirloom, the town your grandmother grew up in, or a monument at the center of your community. It is also about the body, with more and more Americans engaging in genealogical research to build their family trees through services like Family Search. In academia, we sometimes refer to this all as public history, meaning how the past shows up in everyday American life outside of books or the classroom. In Utah, the DUP are at the forefront of our state's public history, connecting to nearly every facet. They build monuments, they collect artifacts, they manage museums, and they publish detailed history lessons. Despite this, no historian has given a full organizational history of the DUP until now. Here's a quick slide showing you the topics and years I am covering in today's presentation. This is not at all exhaustive, but it's meant to just give you a taste of this group's first 50 years. I'm hoping at the end of this you can come to appreciate the DUP's massive impact on how we think about history, identity, and belonging in our state. To begin, the DUP formed in 1901, just 5 years after Utah achieved statehood. Although Utah was being brought into the fold of the greater nation during this period, it was actually a pretty contentious time, especially for Mormons, and especially for Mormon women. Although the DUP is not entirely Mormon today, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or LDS Church, has had a massive impact on the group, which has historically been entirely Mormon-led. After the 1890 manifesto, signed by Wilford Woodruff, did away with Mormon polygamy, Utah statehood became much more attainable, but polygamy, itself a federal crime, did not disappear overnight. The founders of the DUP themselves, the first daughters, were almost all plural wives, or daughters of polygamist families. When they formed the DUP, there was immense pressure to conform to the rest of America. Negotiating their identities as modern Mormon women, leaving the familial structure that they were raised in, turning to history was a way to cope with this period of immense change and even loss. Forming a women's heritage organization in 1901 was appealing for other reasons as well. Across the United States, ladies' literary clubs, activist groups, and historical societies sprung up by the dozen, with some of the most famous from this period being the United Daughters of Confederacy, or UDC, and the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR. These women's groups were a place where affluent white American women could share ideas, connect with one another, and even form the political coalition that led to the vote. For Mormon women, descended from Mormon polygamist pioneers and newly admitted to Utah statehood, there's something attractive about proving your American roots and culture through a historical society. However, they were banned from societies like the DAR because of their polygamous ties until 1910. Forming their own women's heritage society was a way to celebrate the past in your family that was respectable, and it furthered the intellectual development of the nation and the nation's children. So, in this political atmosphere, the DUP formed on April 11th, 1901, in the home of Annie Taylor Hyde. From its very beginning, the DUP has been focused on collecting pioneer information, commemorating pioneer activities, and assigning the past with moral meaning. Almost immediately, the DUP were welcomed by Utah society and met success. Their first 10 years were spent hosting pioneers who spoke about their personal experiences, and these stories were meticulously documented in organizational minutes. They were, in essence, oral histories from the pioneers. These histories would later become recorded pioneer histories in the DUP archive. And of course, they also began collecting artifacts owned by the pioneers in displays at the Deseret Museum and the Lion House in downtown Salt Lake City. Beyond collecting these reminiscences and objects, the DUP also proved to be an important social and political platform during the early 20th century, hosting local leaders such as Utah Governor John C. Cutler and LDS President Joseph F. Smith, who you can see up here. These early meetings often included both men and women attendees, and male speakers addressed topics like Utah economics, politics, and an overall desire to assimilate as Americans. This was especially clear at the meetings featuring U.S. Senator Reed Smoot, whose 1903 election to Congress was stained with tension and controversy because of his Mormon lineage. Anti-Mormon sentiment drove much of the investigation into Smoot and led to his expulsion in 1907, as you can see here with this cartoon showing Smoot as a puppet and Joseph F. Smith as the puppeteer. When Reed Smoot spoke to the DUP in June 1907, just 4 months after his expulsion, Smoot alluded to his desire to be integrated into the broader American culture, despite his Mormon heritage. According to the minutes, his speech connected the Utah pioneers to the wider, quote, founding and pioneering of our great Commonwealth, unquote. He described this scene while attending a convention in Denver, Colorado, where someone, quote, spoke of the work of pioneering Wyoming. I called their attention to the great work done by our people in pioneering this Western country, unquote. This illustrates how Mormon pioneer history was a source of both conflict and identity for men such as Smoot, who found themselves having to validate their new American status to federal powers. Here at the DUP, those leaders could work through that. And this common recurrence of male speakers in the early years of the DUP perhaps undermines its roots as a women's heritage organization, but the amount of male speakers of such high social rank points to the political influence the DUP had even in their earliest years. Seemingly overnight from their first meeting, they became one of Utah's main platforms to promote political beliefs, the LDS faith, and a reverence for the past in a way that highlighted current Utah topics and also lobbied for Mormon Utah's new American identity. Despite their success, the DUP's first 20 years were also characterized by some growing pains as they worked out exactly what their organization would look like for the future. Much of this tension was distilled during the Susie Young Gates presidency, lasting 1905 to 1908. Susie Young Gates was a daughter of Brigham Young and a very passionate founding member of the DUP. As president, she accomplished much more than any of her predecessors. She established an official relics committee and actually obtained the physical space to display the objects. She also established an executive board to more officially govern the organization with clear committees overseeing genealogy, finances, events, and communications. She eventually split from the DUP to work for the LDS church-run Utah Genealogical Society, now known as Family Search. Gates left in part because of ideological differences over what the DUP is for and how it should be run. While some women of the DUP saw it as a way to share ideas and document history in an intellectual and celebratory way, Gates wanted to focus the organization more on temple work, including baptisms for the dead, which required significant genealogical research and which Gates felt to be her spiritual calling. She actually proposed officially restricting DUP membership to only LDS church members in 1907, changing the group's name to the Daughters of Mormon Pioneers. The other members of the DUP completely rejected this idea, and Gates was ousted as president, although she remained a DUP member. This is an incredibly important moment in DUP history because it illustrates their desire to remain separate from the LDS Church administratively. My explanation for this has two parts. First, women in the LDS Church were losing power rapidly during the 1920s. Relief Society buildings and properties were seized and reallocated to other church activities, and women were giving blessings at a much slower rate. A bit of background on that, there's a really long tradition of Mormon women giving blessings in the 19th century. There's a lot of scholarship on that, we can talk after, but the long story short is that by the 1930s, that was pretty much gone. Second part of the explanation, having a separation from the church or any religion granted intellectual and political legitimacy to the DUP because of this American idea of the separation of church and state. The DUP wanted to seem modern, intentional, intellectual, and at this time, religion was becoming part of the superstitious, the backwards, and traditional. In an embrace of modernity, the DUP could claim they were secular, while still singing hymns and giving prayers at the beginning of every meeting. It was more of a political, cultural gesture to distance themselves from the church than a practical implementation, as doing history work remains incredibly spiritual for Mormons even up to today. So from the 1910s on, the DUP continued their work in earnest, casting themselves as a secular, non-political women's group devoted to commemorating the past and instilling a sense of citizenship into Utahns. After Gates' presidency, and particularly in the 1920s, their membership completely exploded. This was made possible by the organization's expansion of the so-called pioneer period. Membership eligibility was originally restricted to those descended from pioneers who came prior to 1853. But eventually the DUP extended that cutoff date to 1869, the year the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Between 1911 and 1921 alone, their numbers grew from a few hundred to over 3,000 members. All over Utah, new camps formed under the guidance of the State Central Board in Salt Lake City. These small camps held meetings, elections, and events for the public that promoted pioneer heritage as the dominant Utah identity. This change also allowed many who came in the handcart companies or other late-coming groups to claim pioneer heritage and DUP membership, something that was increasingly representing prestige and belonging in Utah. So what is so important about belonging in Utah? It is no mistake that DUP membership and pioneer genealogy was something to covet in the 1920s. During the 1920s, the nation was caught up in fraught conversations about who gets to be an American, who is truly a citizen. In 1924, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act placed quotas on incoming foreign nationals for the first time. This was a welcome legislation to many white Americans who were anxious about the ethnic diversity coming to US cities like Salt Lake. Women and the Native Americans received voting rights and citizenship protections in the 1920s, and on top of that, this was the height of Jim Crow policies that restricted African American movement, economics, voting, and safety. To summarize, having pioneer lineage, proving you're a part of the American project of expanding westward, was an assertion of American identity in a period of anti-immigrant, anti-Black politics, making the DUP's work ever more important for Utahns who wanted that sense of security. One way the DUP laid claim to their belonging in Utah was through this process historians like to call placemaking. Placemaking is a complex intellectual and cultural process where space, a desert, a street, a building, becomes a place, a location with meaning that symbolizes an event, a person, or a community. That was the case with Ensign Peak, where a mound in the Salt Lake City foothills is representative of the LDS faith and the arrival of white settlers in what was at that time Mexico. For the DUP, their placemaking efforts also focused on Utah nature, specifically on trees. This may seem a bit odd, but many heritage groups across the US engaged in this idea one historian has called arbo-nationalism. Dating all the way back to the Revolutionary War, trees have been emblems of liberty in the American consciousness. Thomas Paine wrote a poem about the Liberty Tree, and the planting of cherry trees to honor George Washington's birthday is an example of this. Here in Utah, the women of the DUP collected physical relics of trees, like seeds or sticks from the pioneer period, and they also planted trees at the Utah State Capitol building in honor of Arbor Day. Arbor Day was started in the 1800s, but it exploded in popularity after World War I as a way to honor returned veterans, politicians, and historic figures. In the case of the DUP, they planted trees on the Capitol grounds in what they called a pioneer grove to commemorate the women from their own organization. Beyond this yearly celebration, the DUP also protected pioneer trees across Utah at risk of being cut down. Across the state, different kinds of trees were evidence of pioneer settlement, sometimes the only evidence. Pioneers brought maple, elm, oaks, ash, and chestnut trees that were recognizably different from the aspen, fir, or juniper that naturally grows in Utah. For the DUP, historic trees were evidence of the colonization of the West and the spread of civilization into the wild, making the desert blossom as the rose, as they say. As a result, the DUP rallied the residents of small towns like Springville, Payson, and Salem to pressure city officials to preserve old trees and place plaques on them, enshrining their importance as historical monuments. Over the course of the early 20th century, Utah pioneer trees transformed from a passive piece of nature into a monument itself, representing belonging, history, and the control of nature all wrapped into one. But over time, the DUP shifted their preservation attentions away from trees and onto the stone and built world, eventually starting a monument and marker program in 1933. The pivotal changing point for the organization starting this shift was the loss of the historic Salt Lake Theater in downtown Salt Lake City. The demolition of this building is remembered as one of the DUP's biggest failures and one of the greatest historic preservation losses in Utah overall. A pioneer playhouse built in 1862, the Salt Lake Theater was like trees, a symbol of the settler desire to bring civilization into the American West. For the women of the DUP, it represented pioneer culture and refinement, and they fought all they could to protect it. After hearing rumors of demolition in 1926, they approached LDS Church President Heber J. Grant because the LDS Church owned the property. At that time, he assured them that the Salt Lake Theater would, quote, stand forever. But behind the scenes, the LDS Church signed a contract with the Mountain States Telephone and Telegraph Company, selling the land for $200,000. News broke of this in 1928, and the DUP rushed to purchase the land from Mountain Telephone themselves, thinking they could convert the Salt Lake Theater into a museum. They offered the original sale value, but the company rejected the offer. Without ties to interstate banking, real estate, and capitalist brokering, the DUP were left to organize on a community level. At this point, the DUP leaders, under President Fannie Woodruff, devised a plan to work with architects to literally pick up the Salt Lake Theater and relocate it to another plot of land. This would cost $125,000, and fortunately for them, the Utah governor and Salt Lake City mayor were both on board. Woodruff and her fellow daughters then approached local Utah banks to raise the funds, and they got a land developer named Hiram Jensen to donate a plot of land to hold the theater. Everything was lined up and ready to go. But later on, Woodruff reflected that nothing could be done without the buy-in of President Grant and the LDS Church. Jensen was told last minute by President Grant to, quote, keep hands off the theater with no further explanation, and he called off the deal. Although the DUP had courted the capitalist male world of Salt Lake City banking and government in earnest, their work failed to protect the theater, which was eventually razed by the same men they believed to be their closest allies. In the face of this loss of Utah's most beloved and iconic pioneer landmark, the DUP were forever changed. In her report, President Woodruff admitted defeat and humiliation at the course of the events. After Jensen rescinded his offer, the DUP asserted he should issue a public apology in the papers, but he never did, leaving the public to wonder why the DUP rejected a secure future for the theater. Maybe the day will come when everybody will know why the Daughters of Utah Pioneers didn't save the Salt Lake Theater, she concluded in her remarks. Well, now you all know, and I like to think Fanny is watching us. I got you, Fanny. It was in this atmosphere that the DUP began to focus their efforts on monuments, markers, and building preservation in earnest. No longer a women's society concerned with trees, after 1928, the DUP transformed into a bastion of history and preservation focused on the stone and built world. At this time, the DUP's robust and expansive marker program was born. The iconic DUP marker insignia of today, this metal plaque with an ox yoke, a beehive, and a marker number, was first imagined by DUP historian Florence Horn in 1926, and then it became a reality in 1933. Here are some examples from here in Sanpete County. It was funded by every DUP camp at 10 cents per daughter per year. Each county throughout Utah began to apply for markers, submitting the text for the State Central Board approval, and erecting them with ceremonies that featured history, poetry, singing, and prayer. The very first official DUP marker built under this system was in Tooele on November 12, 1934. It commemorated the location of the first pioneer camp settled in Tooele County in 1849. The monument was built with local labor and local Utah granite, and during the ceremony, the Tooele Mayor, American Legion, and local daughters all spoke, initiating a new era in DUP placemaking across the state. Since the construction of that first marker in Tooele, DUP markers total 552 as of September 2024, with more and more being added. Their plaques are a beloved, familiar sight to see for many Utah road trippers with an interest in history. But they also expand beyond Utah, even overseas in Hawaii and Europe. In all of these examples, preserving pioneer trees, preserving pioneer buildings, and building these monuments and markers, there is a desire to preserve but really return to a nostalgic pioneer past. Going to the same physical space as the pioneers serves as a sort of pilgrimage for the DUP and others who visit their markers. In the post-World War II period of industrialization, the US highway system expanded, cutting through small towns and historic buildings. However, the DUP were always there with a solution to save the building or to build a plaque. The DUP have also taken efforts to be more mindful and inclusive in their recent markers, remedying text or adding new markers to represent the past more fairly as our ideas about history change. This was the case with the Bear River Massacre marker, number 186. Originally placed in 1953, it called the deadly event a battle and only told of the pioneer women who cared for the soldiers who carried out the deed. The new DUP marker, number 590, placed in 2021, was written to better reflect the impact of the event on the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Tribe. The original marker was left in place to represent how the narratives and ideas around the place have changed. As the keepers of Utah public memory, doing work in stone, as the DUP have done, has still required some flexibility and shifting over time, as the nature of Utah identity itself has changed. In their vision of connecting the public to the past, the DUP have made an effort to use physical space to cultivate that feeling of reverence and reflection at these sites. So back in time to the 1940s, with the monument program well underway, the focus of the DUP was above all on getting a building of their own. The State Central Board had a tiny office in the Utah State Capitol building, but they wanted to expand and erect a memorial building to pioneer memory and material culture, hopefully opening just in time for the 1947 centennial of the arrival of the first pioneers. At that time, Kate Carter was the DUP president and a strong leader. Her political savviness and deep passion for pioneer research led to possibly the most successful achievement of any DUP president. She got them their building and a second one in the 1970s. As you can see here, it was an exact replica of the Salt Lake Theater the DUP had lost just 20 years prior. A little bit about what's going on in this image. That is a newspaper article those are both newspaper articles pasted over the minutes. So the minute book was this handwritten cursive behind it. I really love the one on the left that shows the log cabin, the kind of iconic pioneer museum, but then up in the clouds is the new Pioneer Memorial as kind of like this dream in the sky. So the DUP asked the 1945 Utah State Legislature for $225,000 for memorial building funding. The daughters, in turn, would raise $75,000 through private donors and their own camps. The local department store, Our Box, was among the first to donate to the DUP's building fund, indicating some public support for the move. The state legislature also approved the DUP's use of a plot of state land, where the DUP could have their building for a lease of 99 years at $1 a year. But the impact of Carter, the woman on the right, is not to be underestimated. If there is one woman I want you to remember from my talk today regarding the DUP, it is Kate Carter. She was a remarkable force of a woman and the longest running DUP president, serving the society for 35 years. Her father was Icelandic, and after immigrating to Spanish Fork, he continued to tell her sagas from his homeland while she sat on his knee as a child. Growing up, Carter kept this passion for storytelling, history, and documenting the past. She joined the DUP Central Board in 1931, offering to use her typing and research skills to compile short lessons for camps to read. This would offer the rural DUP camps something to center their meetings around and would standardize the DUP meetings into a sort of history curriculum. In the past, this had been done using history textbooks provided by male historians at the University of Utah. But with Carter's research, the DUP started to highlight lesser-known pioneer stories. Their series of lessons focused on what we might call folk history of pioneer life. Carter talked about music, food, children, medicine, African American pioneers, women pioneers, and other less studied topics from American history. Perhaps more impressively, she published and marketed books about these topics that totally took over the Utah history book market. She helped the daughters publish their own county histories, like this one you may have seen before from the Sanpete daughters called These Are Fathers. Perhaps most famous was this series called Heartthrobs of the West, which was compiled, it compiled all the DUP lessons into these beautiful, almost encyclopedia-looking books. DUP members bought these, but they were also sold to the public, and these sales were what helped fund the Pioneer Memorial Museum, finally completed in 1950. But Carter was also a difficult, controversial, and strong-willed individual. Under her reign as DUP president, the organization became much more inwardly focused, partially out of Carter's own personality, but also out of self-preservation. She emphasized in the meetings that everything said at the DUP must be confidential, a big departure from the open meetings with Reed Smoot or living pioneers that the DUP started with. She also said that the DUP archive was not to be used by anyone who was not a daughter. So genealogical researchers, historians, or journalists were barred from the DUP's vast archive of pioneer histories. Instead, Carter insisted they could buy our books and give back to the organization that way. Here is a slide showing every organization Carter said no to with the associated minute dates. As you can see, her publication series was so popular that the DUP were often approached for collaborations, opportunities, permissions, but Carter repeatedly turned down external partners in order to protect her time and her organization's reputation. There's good reason for Carter to have been so cautious about preserving the DUP's public image during this time. During the late 1960s, academic history was undergoing massive changes that affected the very core of what the DUP stood for. In the wake of the civil rights movement and second wave feminism, historians were starting to think about how to make history more inclusive of everybody. And although Carter engaged with these questions through progressive stories about Black pioneers or women leaders, there is still public debate about the role of the DUP in Utah history and whether they represent every Utahn. You may have noticed that I said their Pioneer Memorial Museum was not finished until 1950, despite receiving legislative funding in 1945. What happened in the 5 years in between? During this time, the DUP were embroiled in a lawsuit about the very purpose and legitimacy of their organization, where a plaintiff sued them for receiving public funds despite being a religious institution. This question of whether the DUP are indeed religious or not went all the way to Utah's Supreme Court. In the end, the Supreme Court sided with the DUP, saying that in documenting pioneer history, the group is doing a public service for the state's history rather than just promoting the LDS faith. However, this court case illuminates a serious anxiety within Utah's history that has remained since the 1950s. Who belongs in Utah? What makes a Utahn? Is it pioneer stock? Is it LDS conversion? Or is it something wider than what the DUP stand for? These questions are at the forefront of our minds today. Across the street from the DUP Pioneer Memorial Museum on Utah State Capitol grounds, the Utah Historical Society is constructing the Museum of Utah to be completed in 2026. The motivation behind this building is that the Utah legislature realized Utah and Hawaii are the last two states in the US to not have a state-run history museum. This Utah State History Museum will tell a much wider story about Utah's past than just the pioneer period. Historians are famously bad at making predictions, but I personally do not think the two museums will be in competition with one another. Rather, I believe this gives us an opportunity to reckon with the legacy of settler colonialism in Utah in a way that we haven't done before. In understanding the DUP and what they have done since their formation in 1901, we can start to understand the power of the stories we tell and our ability to include and exclude through history itself. Although the DUP have changed much since 1950 when this talk ends, I hope I have helped paint a picture of their organization in a way that shows that history is not neutral. History has never been neutral in Utah, and the way we think about the past must always be put in context, whether that context is Mormon Americanization, World War II urbanization, or a desire to create a sense of belonging in the face of immense change. We are agents in the creation of our shared stories, just as the DUP have been before. Thank you for your time.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes for questions, and as always, for the live stream, we want to make sure that whoever asks a question has a microphone available, and on this side, Lily will have one, and Maya will have one on the other side. So take a minute to think about the questions, and while you do, maybe I'll start the first one, because I'm really interested in this. You use the term history all of the time, and I'm wondering, because the way often I've thought about the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers and the way that they present history is a way of, I don't know, of trying to remember the past. I don't know, would you call the Daughters of Utah Pioneers like a historical society, or a society that focuses more on memory of historical events?
I think it's absolutely appropriate to say that they push the boundaries of what a historical society does, because a lot of what the DUP do goes beyond what happened in the past, and it becomes about myth, memory, feeling, morality, spirituality. And I think that can be very uncomfortable for historians like you and me, where we went to school and we're getting our PhDs, and it's like history is done a certain way. But that phenomenon of a historian having to have a PhD is really something from the 1960s. Prior to the 1960s, if you were writing about the American West, most of the time you are an amateur historian. This is part of the history of the Western History Association. It was founded in the 1960s by a mixture of academics who had PhDs and women like Kate Carter who didn't. And I think that in this period that I'm talking about, I was really fast and loose with the term because there wasn't really a difference in my eyes. But I think that something that's interesting about my project is it shows how, as a public in Utah, we became very discerning about who we allowed to be a historian after 1960. And whether that's a good thing or not, I have not decided. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Megan, for such a wonderful presentation. I'm thinking of the slide of you kind of neck deep in the archive and reaching out as an academic from the university, doing formal, thoroughgoing historical work in the organization that you've described up to this point as having some hesitation about having distanced themselves from academia or the kind of the more formal discipline of history. I guess I'm wondering, in your work with the organization at this point, how open or interested are you finding DUP to be? I mean, obviously you're working with them. More broadly, generally, is this something that is coming from outside scholars and researchers like you, or is there an appetite or gestures from within the organization like, hey, we see the value of this, or we want to pursue this further? Yeah.
There definitely is an appetite. So like I said, really since Kate Carter, the DUP have been pretty cautious of outsiders, and they've been very reluctant to let people look at their minutes, especially these administrative minutes held at the Pioneer Memorial Museum in Salt Lake. As far as I know, I'm the first historian to really be reading them and using them in a project. And I wasn't sure if they would let me. I went into this project thinking like, I really want to be respectful that, this is an organization that doesn't have to open up to me. But what I did was I started just volunteering at the DUP in 2019 as a docent at their front desk. And I became friends with the archivist and the gift shop manager, and they're a really amazing group of women. And I've cultivated those friendships, which I think has helped them, want to trust me with a project like this. But I did have to write a project proposal where I said, hey, this is for my dissertation. Here's what I want to do with your minutes. Here's what I want to cover. And they've been really supportive and really excited about it. So I think we're kind of in a new era of the DUP, absolutely. That's why I'm ending in 2001, not 2021, because as the 21st century came in, things changed pretty fast. But yeah, I have been very grateful that they have been willing to open up to me. And in terms of this idea of academic versus amateur, I think that even that idea is breaking down within the history discipline because of this public history scholarship. So I think that from the 1970s to 2000s-ish, this is just my gut feeling, I think that there was an assumption that professional historians are the authority. But especially since 2020, in the age of the internet, what authority means, what expertise means is really under fire. And like I said, that's for mixed results. But in the world of history, we are now seeing communities as experts in their own history. And you can see that with like oral histories that prioritize marginalized communities. Once you center the group and their lived experience, you just get better data. And I'm trying to bring that mentality to the DUP, where I see them as the experts of their own past. So I'm trying to not have an ivory tower mentality about this. Not applicable for everybody, but it works for me.
Turn it on. Time for one more question. Okay, if not, I know that Megan said she'd stand around if you have questions you don't want to ask in front of everybody else. Also, let's give a warm round of applause for our speaker today. And
Thank you so much.
And again, if you have questions for me or for Megan, please come up and we'll see you next week. Thank you.